Hello everyone, I'm Jia. Today I'm going to discuss with my partner Yanru on the issue of three orientations, educational modernization and internalization of China. In this video, we are briefly talking about modernization and internalization of China based on the famous guideline Three Orientations, proposed by Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader of China in 1983. It says that gear education to modernization, the world, and the future. Three orientations guideline has slowly filtered into people's minds, become the banner and soul of the Chinese educational reform and development. The idea of three orientations has become the guidelines of educational development and reform for over 20 years. We choose to analyze this saying because it wins universal praise in China, and for quite a long time, all educators take the saying as the pattern. In the following session, we'll unpack the meanings of the three important concepts, modernization, the world, and the future, respectively, in Chinese context, and illustrate what the guidelines are based on and applied in educational practices, as well as the consequences it brings about. Now, let's begin our analysis from the first concept, modernization. Generally, the concept of modern is opposed to that of the traditional. Now, when I say modern, what can you imagine in your mind? The assembly line in busy factories, modern-looking buildings along the crowded street, or the world-renowned universities with advanced laboratories. Now, how about traditional? What do the pictures in your mind look like? Local farmers in rags working in the field, feudal superstitions flooded every corner of the society, or people made their effort to make a rise in life by mechanically reciting Confucius classics such as the Four Books and the Five Classics, and passing national exams. Did you notice that we consider what is modern as advanced, which we should fight for, but connect what is traditional with outmoded drills that should be discarded? Why do we take it for granted? Is it a truth? Before the First Opium War, China was a self-contained civilization with a favorable balance of trade in limited contact with the world. While the West desired for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain pottery, there was correspondingly little demand in China for Europe's manufactured goods and other trade items. So European silver constantly flowed into China. To counter the imbalance, Britain and other European countries allowed private illegal opium trade with China, which led to worry and resistance of Chinese government. After Chinese officials confiscated and destroyed a significant quantity of European opium, British government responded with a war and defeated China with modern gunboats. It is our failure in the First Opium War and in a series of colonial wars followed by that constructed the concept of a decayed China falling behind. If the West had not started wars, what would have happened to China and Chinese education? If it were not colonial wars, what would the global landscape look like? Gandhi was once asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" "I think it would be a good idea," he replied. Being modern does not necessarily mean being advanced. Modernization is not a historical and neutral concept. Instead, the unequal position, the concept of being advanced and falling behind are created and constructed in the history of colonialism. The different national conditions have created two educational systems that contrast sharply. Based on Confucianism, Chinese traditional education was served to select talents who could assist in consolidating the power of the ruling class, which demonstrated a strong political complexion. While Western education uses the experience and wisdom of thinkers in the Enlightenment movement, attaching great importance to the development of science and technology, aiming at cultivating skilled workers to improve the social productivity. When we talk about education, we tend to value the Western style of education, which in our opinions is the only path of modernization. A question that has been bothering us for decades is that why does educational modernization equal to westernizing education? Why don't we pay as much attention to the wisdom of traditional China as we do to our Western education? which is one of the most illustrious achievements of human endeavor, whose tradition affected not only Chinese people, but also those of Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. The blind worship that Western knowledge is superior and effective, and a stereotype that non Western knowledge is neither practical nor contributing to enhancing social productivity, got us thinking what kind of global imaginary convinces us that there is only one single variety of corn cob, which is the yellow corn cob. Who defines it? Why do other corns accept the standard and cater to it? The articulation of this global imaginary stems from a desire for global knowledge economy, presuming the universal value of Western knowledge such that many non-Western countries are thought to have lower GDP because they lack adequate knowledge capital that will allow them to increase productivity. It is deep-rooted in the supremacy of Western knowledge, as well as the implicit commitment to the preservation of Western economic advantage. Unless we identify and address this global imaginary and how it operates in higher education, we may continue to reproduce the racialized hierarchy of humanity upon which it was initially instituted.
I know some may argue that, well, it may be true that we unconsciously consider Western education advanced and as the only way of education, but it is the most effective and productive way to develop. It is modern Western education that allows a better life. So, in part two, we'll talk about a better life and the concept of the future. First, what does the future look like to you? Skyscrapers, flying machines, AI, everyone lives the lavish life. Does it sound a better life for you? I think so. So where does the imaginary about future or a better life come from? And whose imaginary is it? Let's first think about what the future looks like in traditional Chinese philosophy. Remember Datong, or the Great Unity? It is a Chinese utopian vision of the world in which everyone and everything is at peace with equal relations. So we once had a different imaginary. Then why do we believe there is only one future? Just as the metaphor of yellow corn cobs shows, we have this global imaginary that there is only one linear path of development and progress. But is it true? Now we are looking at the third concept, to the world. What are we talking about when we talk about the world? When I say the world, what can you imagine? Landmarks in metropolis such as these ones? What, what about these places? Did the non-Western world occur to you? Which part of the world do you think we should gear education to? Well, maybe the Western world. Then why did we neglect the other part? Actually, we unconsciously divided the world into the core, which controls resources, wealth, and powers, and the periphery. We aim to enter the core, while intend to neglect the invisible periphery. So when we talk about gear education to the world, we actually mean to the core. So what does to the world look like regarding Chinese higher education now? In 2015, Chinese government issued a tertiary education development initiative, namely the double first class, aiming to comprehensively develop elite Chinese universities and their departments into world-class institutions. In 2016, the government issued an important document concerning opening up of education. So what are we talking about when we talk about opening up and world first class? First, global competitiveness. China and Chinese higher education desire for reputation and recognition, moving from left behind to a leading position, from the periphery to the core. And that's why we increasingly concerned about world university rankings such as QS, Times Higher Education, and US News. And do you know who designed these rankings? Right, mostly by international companies and organizations in the UK and the US. Here I want to ask you a question. Did you know Shanghai ranking, or academic ranking of world universities? I believe only few of you knew it. Shanghai ranking is originally designed and issued by Shanghai Jiaotong University in 2003. Actually, it's the first global university ranking with multifarious indicators. Then why didn't we know it? Or why did we neglect it? Why do we focus only on Western rankings? Yes, because of unequal socioeconomic positions and academic hierarchy. So, how we rank universities is not recognized by the world or the Western world. Only in the West, however, which positioned at the highest level of the hierarchy, has the entitlement, and we, positioned lower, need the recognition from the West. So we desire for higher positions in Western rankings to get higher positions in the hierarchy. Then what are the criteria of the rankings? For instance, QS looks at academic reputation, employer reputation, faculty students ratio, citations per faculty, international faculty and student ratio. As responses, we attached increasing importance on educational internationalization. For example, internationalization of curricula, especially regarding natural science, technology, and business. Here, internationalization generally refers to westernization. Have you ever seen indigenous curricula introduced to China? In fact, Western knowledge has been expanded to non-Western world, but not vice versa. Second, the publish or perish policy. Whether a student or a scholar can be admitted, graduate, be hired, or promote is closely linked to the number of their articles published in high-level international academic journals. Once again, international here refers to Western, or more specifically, Anglo-American, which forced scholars and students to learn Western academic norms and English academic writing. And the last one, recruitment of international faculty and students, as well as returnees. There are Chinese students who graduated in universities abroad and returned to China. They are generally considered more competitive in employment market and in Chinese academia because the education they received abroad is believed of higher quality compared to domestic education. Also, they are more familiar with Western academic norms and have better global competence, which are considered advantages. Now, have you noticed the underlying Western knowledge supremacy, language hegemony, and academic hierarchy in educational internationalization? Why do you think we actively accommodated Chinese higher education to the Western academic norms instead of challenging its hegemony? So recruitment of returnees as well as international faculty and students is what we call inviting in, which is an important aspect of opening up. Here we'd like to talk more about international students. In 2018, there were more than 490,000 international students studying in China, according to Chinese Ministry of Education. As we mentioned, Chinese higher education are at a disadvantage in the global academic hierarchy. In order to attract more international students, Chinese universities lower requirements of their admission and graduation and provide preferential treatment such as easier access to scholarships and better housing, like this. Now, what do you think if you were a student? Do you think it is fair? Do you think international students are taking advantage? Does the university need to change towards educational equality? Then what if you were the president of the university? Will you have the same answers? And what if you were leader of the nation? Did positions change your opinion? If so, why? And have you ever taken the standpoint of international students themselves? In the West, international students may be considered as cash contributing to institutional and national economy or as competitors threatening local citizens' entitlements to resources and opportunities. Are we to some extent reproducing the pattern? Do we consider international students as a tool for branding and soft power construction? Identifying problems is only the first step. Here are some other questions you could think about. As there is not only one linear path of development, how can we imagine the alternatives? How can we make use of Chinese traditional knowledge or Chinese characteristics constantly emphasized by the state yet hard to achieve? When we say global competitiveness, what is the competition? What are we pursuing in this competition? As members of the non-Western world, are we innocent in perpetrating inequality? Are we reproducing inequality and maintaining colonial patterns when we embrace the hierarchy instead of challenge it? Why is it so hard to challenge it? What are the roles of higher education institutions and the faculty in the inevitable internationalization of higher education? After identifying underlying issues, what can we do? One thing requires emphasis is that there is no simple answer or solution.